Good morning, my name is Stephen York. I'm the pastor of the Stonington United Methodist Church in Stonington, Maine in the United States. I'd like to welcome those of you who are watching in different parts of the world and Maine, throughout the country and other countries, as you listen to the sermon that I'm preaching this morning. The sermon title is a question that I want to ask you and those who are present here at the church. And that is this: what matters the most to you? Today's readings from both Proverbs and then in the little short reading in Luke and the readings from Mary Oliver and Jane Kenyon have a theme that I believe addresses this vital question. But before I begin with that, I want to ask you to think for a moment. What matters the most to you? What matters the most to you in your life now? It's those questions that I find that grab us, and there comes times in our lives when we ask them. Sometimes when there is a crisis in our family or personal crises. Sometimes during the aging process. Sometimes when a child is born into our family or a grandchild, the question becomes, what's most important to you? As you think about that this morning, the last verse in the gospel reading is very familiar in the King James translation. And so I'm going to repeat it to you. Jesus said, "A person's life does not consist in the abundance of the things that they possess." And what he meant with that saying was that life is more than what we own. When I was a very little boy in North Brookfield, Massachusetts, my grandmother was a nurse. She had started her nursing in Bridgeton, Maine, and then came over here in the 30s to be a nurse in Blue Hill. And by that time in their lives, they were in North Brookfield. And one of the things that I don't really remember, but I have the pictures of it, when I was about 4 years old, my grandparents lived in what was called in those days a cold water flat. If you know what that means, you know what that means. There was no hot water available. And one night, because my grandmother worked the overnight shift in giving home care to people who had the ways and means to have home care and nurse duty, back in the days when doctors made hospital calls, home calls, you remember that. In the middle of the night, my grandparents' apartment building caught on fire. And my grandfather, the one that I love and quote all the time, had to jump out of the window in order to have his life saved. And they lost everything. There was one thing that he brought with him, and that was he grabbed his Bible as he hauled it out. And you can see, and I have a copy of that Bible in my possessions because I inherited some of these things, that it had been singed. But the most important thing to him at that point in his life, beyond getting out of this apartment fire that woke him up in the middle of the night and having literally to get out of the window to escape the fire, and firemen were there, and I don't know whether he jumped or what the details were, because I was 4, but I have the news clippings. But he grabbed what he thought was important to him. In a moment of crisis, in a moment of deep reflection, there are things that matter most to us. What we learn in the book of Proverbs in the reading is that you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have wisdom, if you don't have friendship, if you don't have integrity, if you don't have love, you may have a lot of things, but there are other things that you are missing. Solomon said. When I hear the words of Mary Oliver, I'm reminded in her book, Thirst, which we read from this morning, that it was after the death of her partner of 40 years that she had a rekindling of her desire or thirst for the spiritual and returned to church. And much of her poetry is a poetry of sadness and trying to understand. Here's this Pulitzer Prize National Book Award winner who's confronting life, having all of these accolades, having had a wonderful partnership for 40 years, and it's gone, and she's now looking at nature and the larger questions. What matters the most to you? What matters the most to you? Jesus was always getting hooked into somebody's argument. Sometimes religious Pharisees, the lawyers, would try to set him up to play gotcha. And some man spoke up while he's teaching. Imagine, Jesus is teaching, and while he's teaching, someone stands up in the middle of his teaching and says, "Hey, Master, would you please tell my brother to give me my share of the family inheritance?" I'll tell you what, if you did this, there are a few people that sit you down if it happened during my service. But Jesus responded and said, "What makes you think I'm supposed to arbitrate that?" And then he responds, "A person's possessions are not the sum substance of their existence." And yet we know that there are people today who live in multi-million-dollar homes, who have lifestyles, and we see it on Entertainment Tonight or whatever your poison is, and these people are in horrible shape. Michael Douglas not only was in the War of the Roses film, but now he's living it in his current marital situation. What matters the most to you?